Thank you very much, Ihan, for those kind words of introduction, and thank you to Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and to REFSA for kindly inviting me to be with you today. It's a very difficult act to follow from Jayati, and especially because she's covered a lot of the ground. I would like to elaborate on some of the issues which I think are important for us to consider. First, I think it's important to consider the preceding context before COVID-19, before we focus on COVID-19, both the dangers as well as the opportunities. It is important to recognize that the world has been very different in the last 40 years or so compared to the previous times. What was different was essentially what might be referred to as the neoliberal counter-revolution against Keynesian economics and against development economics. In other words, against the role of the state. It was presumed with the rise of neoliberalism that the state could only do harm, it could never do good. And this view has basically prevailed. At the international level, the so-called Washington Consensus, the shared view of the world held by the Washington-based institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and of course by the US government leadership, ruled and has ruled essentially until the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. Ever since then, we have been in a very difficult situation. Much of the world has been growing much more slowly, and this has been attributed to a number of problems, including the preceding consequences of globalization, financialization, all of course linked to the spread of neoliberalism and the policies associated with it. It's also important to recognize that during this period, there has been the rise or the strengthening of property rights, the rights over land and other forms of property, the increasing reliance on the rule of law and particular interpretations, very, very conservative interpretations of the rule of law have prevailed. And very, very importantly, the increased importance of so-called intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights, which have been extended in ways in which we never expected, have been extended to all kinds of areas of knowledge. Knowledge is now private property, and the holders of intellectual property rights stand in the way of improving the welfare of much of the world. There has undoubtedly been tremendous development in knowledge and in science, in our understanding of how things can be improved, but very often they have come with a huge price tag. That price tag can only be exacted precisely because you have so-called intellectual property rights. So, for example, there is a medicine for hepatitis C. Many people in Asia suffer from. In Malaysia, which has a population of slightly over 34 million people, about 500,000 people, in other words, well over 1% of the population, have hepatitis C. The treatment for hepatitis C costs about 1,300 ringgit if bought, as in Malaysia's case, from an Egyptian generic medicines company. The American equivalent with the strong intellectual property rights costs 300,000 ringgit. In other words, the American equivalent costs more than 200 times as much. Now, this prevails in for many other medicines, and you can see, therefore, why the fight over vaccines and who has access to vaccines has become important in the recent period. All this, of course, has led to a tremendous concentration of power. Jayati correctly mentioned the power of so-called digital companies which have taken advantage of the new technology in very, very creative and lucrative ways. All this has been very, very important. And so you have now many companies in the world which have economies bigger than many of the economies of the world. And the power of these companies is not to be understated, not to be underestimated. And there's nothing to prevent these companies from exerting influence in many different ways. There are no laws which prevent them from exerting that kind of influence. Now, many of these companies are, of course, American, but some of them are European, some of them are Japanese, and many of them increasingly are now Chinese. There are different constraints in different parts of the world on what companies can do and cannot do, but the most unrestrained environment is probably the American environment. Now, one of the major features which have transformed the world as we knew it basically begins really from the 1980s into and goes on to the present. This feature, which many people refer to as financialization, has seen two things. One, the strengthening of the power of banks, but not just the traditional commercial banks which intermediated between savings and investments, but also very, very importantly, banks which have played a tremendous role, sorry, not banks, but other financial institutions which have played a tremendous role in the economy, which now shape the functioning of stock markets and so on and so forth. So all this has led to a new type of economy, in which what has been termed shareholder value extraction, abuse by powerful shareholders, has become quite rampant, especially in certain parts of the Anglo-American world. It's also important for us to recognize that, as Jyoti again mentioned, we have seen tremendous developments in terms of automation as well as digitization. And much of this has been labor displacing. Undoubtedly, in some exceptional cases, they have been job creating as well. But by and large, they have been labor displacing. And these are some of the challenges which we have in terms of what living and working in the 21st century basically implies. Now, two other, and the next point I'd like to move to is about the rise of the rest. As companies moved from the developed countries to many developing country locations to try to lower their costs of production, to take advantage of the relatively cheaper labor which exists in developing countries, we have seen the corresponding loss of jobs in the developed countries. And but to be sure, and Jyoti has shown this in some of her earlier work, the loss of jobs in the developed countries has not been made up by the creation of new jobs in developing countries. In fact, there has been a reduction of new jobs because the process of technological change, of automation, has continued relentlessly. Even with cheaper labor, if automation can do it even more cheaply, this has been the preference of companies. After all, machines, automation does not go on strike. Now, when we think about this, we see that in some countries, this has provided opportunities. That some countries, for example, if you think about what Korea got into, or think about Taiwan province or China itself, and many countries in Southeast Asia, they have become parts of the so-called international supply chains. And in some situations, their own indigenous entrepreneurs have emerged, creating companies, including very large companies. Many of these companies outside of Northeast Asia, including China, have not really been producing new goods. Rather, they have been able to take advantage of financial opportunities and so on to make more and more money. So what we find is that the so-called captains of industry, especially in Southeast Asia, have tended to be foreign rather than domestic. And this, of course, has distorted the character of industrial growth in very, very important ways. So what has happened is that China has successfully taken advantage of the new situations, the new opportunities of the new situations, to develop its own enterprises, its own capitalist enterprises. And these have grown very successfully, so much so that with the leadership of China under much more independent hands than in many other smaller developing countries, we have seen that the rise of the so-called China threat. The China threat is, of course, no threat to many countries in the developing world, but it poses a challenge particularly to the United States. So we have seen, beginning with earlier administrations in the US, a continued obsession, a continued concern with the rise of the so-called China threat, and an attempt in response to try to isolate the rise and to contain the rise of China through various means. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was one such means, and even the refutation of Trans-Pacific Partnership in preference for much more hostile acts of economic aggression has become the norm, especially with the current presidential administration in the United States. So all this basically has led and fed into a new culture of so-called identity politics, but I think identity politics which is very much permeated by what I have termed ethnopopulism. An ethnopopulism which tends to see the other as the enemy, both domestic other as well as the external other as the enemy. And all this, of course, is fed to greater jingoism at the international level, and particularly with following the global financial crisis, what some people call a globalization, and some people claim with COVID-19 might lead to a deglobalization. While it seems to me premature to predict that this will necessarily be the consequence, there is no doubt that there has been a globalization at least since the global financial crisis. The G20 countries, while preaching trade liberalization to the rest of the world, introduce various actions which amount to economic protection. The amount of economic protection introduced in 2009, for instance, after the advent of the global financial crisis, was tremendous and has continued to grow since then. Not surprisingly, international trade patterns have not been changing as much since then, and have grown much, and international trade as well as investment has grown much less even before COVID-19. Now with COVID-19, we have seen how the epidemic has been greatly politicized in many ways, which we will come to in a moment. I think it is important to recognize that the pandemic, having its origins in Wuhan city, as far as we know, at the end of last year, spread very quickly. It spread very quickly, not only within China, but also beyond China. And it's very important to recognize that it was precisely the first countries to which the virus spread within Asia, which have responded probably best. Japan, Korea, Taiwan province, Vietnam, Laos, and Kerala province in southwest India. All these places had authorities which sought to contain the threat, to contain the COVID-19 epidemic threat by taking various measures, but did not resort to stay in shelter lockdown measures. Unfortunately, it is the failure to take those early precautionary and preventive measures which made it impossible not to introduce stay in shelter lockdown measures. Even in China, being unsure about how to handle the crisis during the early weeks of January this year, China introduced stay in shelter lockdown measures in the 3 provinces around Hubei, around Wuhan city in Hubei province. The stay in shelter lockdown measures were not introduced throughout the country, and precisely because of the effectiveness of these measures, we see that the crisis did not spread beyond them. So it is very important to recognize that we in East Asia and in South Asia could have contained the crisis, at least within our own countries, if we had acted quickly enough, learning from other East Asian countries. Unfortunately, many of our societies are too overly influenced by Western examples, Western precedents, Western advice, and many followed the Anglo-American precedents, for example, doing relatively little. And the result, of course, was that the pandemic spread so much so that there was very little choice except to introduce stay-in-shelter lockdown measures on a nationwide scale. So this false choice between life and livelihoods is actually a reflection of the failure of the authorities, because what is needed in response to this crisis is precisely an all-of-government approaches and a whole-of-society response. Without an all-of-government approach, which not only deals with the health consequences, but also with the other consequences, for example, public transportation, safety at the workplace, and so on and so forth, without dealing with everything in our society, with schooling for children, with nutrition for everybody, and so on and so forth, we find ourselves in a much worse off situation. And without involving and trusting people, without trusting all of society to do what is in our collective self-interest, and without taking strong deterrent measures against those who prioritize their own personal convenience above societal interests, unfortunately, the situation has gotten quite out of hand. Now, looking at the situation in the economic disruptions which have come out of COVID-19 have largely been due to the requirements of physical distancing. These requirements of physical distancing have disrupted public transportation, have disrupted workplace situations. And so it has been very difficult for work as normal to continue precisely because of these very, very major disruptions, not only at the workplace, but also in schools and many other places where people tend to come together. And of course, industries such as hospitality services, food eating places, and so on and so forth have been very, very adversely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The requirements of physical distancing, of isolation, and I very much appreciate Sergio Grassi's use of the term physical distancing, because there's absolutely no reason why there should be social distancing because of physical distancing. Of course, certain types of social interactions are no longer possible, that's true, but the kind of social distancing which we have seen in the past in many of our societies, segregation of castes, of low caste people, of outcast people, and so on and so forth, of poor people from rich neighborhoods. These kinds of social distancing are completely unacceptable. So we should not confuse the requirements of physical distancing from social distancing. Now, many of the countries which have been affected have introduced various monetary and fiscal responses. Unfortunately, fiscal responses have not been bold enough. Part of the reason is because there has been a reluctance of governments to borrow in order to spend. There's absolutely no reason for such hesitation, and in fact, by doing so, those governments concerned are actually making the situation far, far worse than it needs to be. Many of the measures which have been introduced have been measures which have been borrowed from the West rather than looking at the Asian society's concern. And so they have done some useful things, for example, paying employers to retain their workers during the period of subsidy. But they have done very little for the huge informal sectors which exist in most of societies. The huge informal sectors, which include, on the one hand, many people who rely on self-employment, who produce in micro, often family enterprises, or hire just a couple of people to help them out. And very, very importantly, you also have the the daily rated workers and many other workers in the informal sector who are not, who do not have any kind of social protection. So those people constitute the vast majority. In Malaysia, for example, leaving aside those who work for the government, only 40% contribute to the Employees Provident Fund, which is in turn a deficient social protection institution. Deficient because more than 80% will not have enough to keep them above the poverty line once they retire from these pension with income from these pension funds. So these are serious problems. In some situations they are much worse. In some situations they are better. But it is absolutely necessary to recognize the very different characters of our societies and economies, and to try to ensure that that governments, through appropriate fiscal policies, do much more to help those in greatest need, the more precarious people, the more people in the informal sector, and so on and so forth. People who live very fragile and vulnerable existences. So very often the monetary measures come on the backs of many other problems. Okay, so you already have many governments on the one hand, as well as many households which are heavily in debt. In Malaysia, for example, more than 70% of households are not in a position to save significantly. They do not have any savings of great significance. So, and this is a country which is almost on the cusp of being considered a high-income country. And just imagine what the situation is like in other more low-income countries in the region. So we have to think about policies which are very appropriate to the economic and social conditions in which we all live. Now, there are two elements which I think are extremely important. One, of course, is relief. The very fact that many of these people who have been hit and adversely affected often due to no fault of their own, but nonetheless are required for obvious public health reasons, required to discontinue their traditional sources of income. They need to have other sources of income in order to retain their livelihoods. And this is one important challenge. It is very often possible, and it is precisely at this time that one should begin to think about providing at least temporarily a universal basic income. True, some people who don't need it will also get those incomes, but they will hopefully spend that money, and that will contribute to increasing aggregate demand. And this becomes extremely important. It's also because they will probably be the ones who will pay taxes. But the formula should be to spend and tax, rather than to tax first and then try to spend later. You can't do that in the middle of a crisis, although that might be desirable in more normal times. Now, one of the major challenges, of course, as we know, is that COVID-19, physical distancing, and other requirements of COVID-19 have disrupted supply chains in a major way. What the trend towards offshoring, which was already interrupted with the global financial crisis from 2008 or so, has seen a reversal to reshoring. Now, to be sure, some of this reshoring has been politically motivated. President Trump and Prime Minister Abe have asked firms from their respective countries to leave China and to come back in. And for many countries in Southeast Asia, we are, of course, intimately tied up with China in terms of supply chains. And when Chinese supply chains are hit, we also tend to be hit, just like many African raw material producers have been adversely affected because of the reduced demand in China for some of these their products. Now, all this basically means that the supply chains which we have become accustomed to are no longer going to be there, and we will need to begin to think very seriously about how to adjust to this situation. It's too premature to talk about adjusting to a new normal. Is there anything which can be described even with some imagination as a normalcy in the current situation, or even in the situation you envisage early next year, for instance? We are very, very far away from being able to be sure about a new normal. But countries do know the kinds of opportunities they have not taken up, paths not taken, which have not taken up in the past because of the seductions and the requirements of globalization and so on and so forth. This is a time to begin to think about this very seriously. And I would begin with something very, very mundane: food. Food. All too many countries do not produce enough food for themselves. And while I'm not suggesting that everybody produces all their own food, it is important to have greater control of the food and to have stricter requirements to ensure that our food supplies are safe as well as healthy. All too often in many of our societies, especially in the last few decades, we have seen the increasing use of agrochemicals, which are toxic in character, sometimes carcinogenic, which put all of us at risk. And of course, the ones most at risk are the agricultural workers who are involved in applying these toxic substances. If we have much more control over our food supplies, we can try to ensure much greater care in ensuring this. And that's why, while it might seem counterintuitive, this is precisely a time when at least there should be school feeding programs for children in primary schools especially. This is one way to guarantee a demand for the farmers who would produce this food in order to sell to the workers. So this would require great cooperation between the education authorities, the health authorities, as well as the agricultural authorities, in order to create a much more circular economy, if you will, which will be much more beneficial to the citizens. Now, the other opportunities, of course, are very, very different, but it's precisely for this reason that it makes sense for us to begin to think about so-called Green New Deals, but not only at the global level, which is absolutely necessary, and we have been calling for this for more than a dozen years, but also to have the Green New Deals at the national level, where economies are much more sensitive to concerns about sustainability and the kinds of sustainability, for example, about the destruction of the natural habitat and so on and so forth, not only through the resource extraction, non-renewable resource extraction, but also other factors. Now, the other question, of course, is what do we expect in this new situation? In this situation, we see ourselves being mobilized for all kinds of big power politics, and we should strive to stay away from this type of big power politics, and we should begin to think very seriously about appropriate state regulations. The era of deregulation and expecting market forces to look after our best interests is really over. Now we need to think about what needs to be done, how we begin to think about risk management and prepare for various types of risks. Not only the risk of COVID-19, which is too late to prepare for in some ways, but also other risks, the likelihood of greater floods due to climate change and so on and so forth. So we need to begin to think about how this whole pandemic offers certain opportunities for accelerating automation and digitization. And as Jyoti correctly emphasized, the ability of us to replace a lot of dreary, hard manual work with much more meaningful work and work which is much more automated and digitized, in order that we can spend much more time doing much more care work. not only in the areas of health as well as education, but also in other areas to improve the human condition. This is how I think we can learn from this opportunity. And so there is an opportunity to create, but rather than waiting for the new normal, we have to make the new normal. We have to make the new normal by recognizing that we cannot rely on outside forces, we cannot rely on market forces as we have been encouraged to believe we can. And these are some of the challenges which we face as we move ahead. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you, and all the best to think about the challenges which we all face, but our conditions are different, and what can work in some certain circumstances may not be appropriate in other circumstances. And it's important for us to be sensitive to the differences in our different conditions as we try to move ahead. Thank you.